Hello, my name is Randall Brooks. I'm the Vice President of Training and Business Development for Aviation Performance Solutions, or APS. I'd like to welcome you to this video presentation of an article published in Skies magazine titled Upset Recovery in the Real World. In November of 2014, the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, called for a revolutionary change in how pilots should be trained in the future. In its recommendation that all commercial pilots should receive upset prevention and recovery training, or UPRT, prior to licensing, ICAO intentionally specified that such training should take place in a real aircraft in addition to a flight simulator. Why did ICAO, the United Nations Agency for the Promotion of Standards and Best Practices in Civil Aviation, feel compelled to recommend that all commercial pilots should have UPRT training? And more interestingly, why did ICAO feel this training should be done in an aircraft as opposed to being done exclusively in a highly sophisticated flight simulator? In our overview of this presentation, we'll look at ICAO's need for upset prevention and recovery training. We'll examine the limits of flight simulation technology today. We'll discuss the physical and psychological limits of flight simulation as they relate to upset prevention and recovery training. We'll look at the challenges of UPRT implementation, and we'll talk about how this training has really come full circle with pilot training historically. In ICAO's call for upset prevention and recovery training, it was spawned by the increased percentage of fatalities from what are termed loss of control in flight, or LOCI, accidents. In recent years, this type of accident has become the #1 cause of fatalities in all categories of civil aviation, including airlines, business and corporate, and general aviation. While basic aircraft control is taught to all pilots, training in what to do when things go wrong, such as when an aircraft is inadvertently upset in flight, has been haphazard and often accomplished in an unregimented and unregulated manner. Airplane upset events are the precursor to the resulting loss of control in flight event. There are a wide variety of causes contributing to the prevalence of the LOCI threat. The increased use of automation and the accompanying lack of manual aircraft handling skills, as well as a departure from the basic fundamentals of airmanship and pilot training, are noted contributors. But the various factors can be grouped into pilot-induced, environmentally induced, and systems anomaly-induced causes. Acting on the clearly indicated predominance of loss of control in flight accidents, with the most recent data showing it is currently responsible for over 41% of all airline fatalities, ICAO felt that dedicated upset prevention and recovery training was required. But why did the organization feel compelled to advocate training in an actual aircraft? The use of flight simulators in modern times represents one of the greatest contributions to aviation safety historically. The ability to train for complicated systems failures and challenging flight conditions in a simulator prepares pilots for a greater range of possible events that they might face that would be unsafe to initiate in an actual aircraft. Engine failures and low visibility landing conditions can be practiced with complete safety without ever leaving the ground. The required fidelity to fully replicate the dynamic motion involved in airplane upset events leading to loss of control is beyond the capability of current flight simulators. Today's flight simulators were never intended for use in teaching upset prevention and recovery training, which is a subject unaddressed until the last few years. They were really created just to replicate aircraft in the normal flying envelope. Even with improvements in data processing and expanded flight envelopes, the complex maneuvering and dynamic aerodynamics associated with airplane upset events cannot be modeled perfectly. Unfortunately, these simulator limitations can underrepresent the difficulty of countering such events, making them seem easier to handle than they might actually be in the real world. In many cases, the simulators that are maneuvered beyond their fidelity limits could demonstrate flight behavior that is inconsistent or even incorrect compared to what pilots would actually experience in flight, causing what is known as negative training, or teaching pilots to do what would be the wrong thing in that situation in flight. Furthermore, even With future advances in simulation technology, there will still be limits to what flight simulation can achieve in this domain, but these limits have more to do with pilots, not with technology. When we discuss the physical and psychological limits of flight simulation, we can begin by discussing the fact that modern high-fidelity flight simulators with motion bases are often referred to as full flight simulators because of their ability to realistically create sensations found in flight. They accomplish this through the use of very accurate visual scene creation and clever manipulation of their motion base to temporarily mimic accelerations which create the illusion of flying for pilots in training. Their physical range of motion, however, limits their ability to create sustained accelerations, often called Gs, that pilots might experience in an upset event. A fact that is significant but often missed by most pilots is their inability to create the sustained experience of less than 1 G, the gravity that we experience on the ground. The light in the seat experience, ideally about a half a G, that pilots might encounter in flight. The ability to manage this reduction in G, or unload condition, can be critical in many loss of control events, but is impossible to practice in a ground-based flight simulator. Perhaps more important than these physiological considerations, we're beginning to learn that the complex psychology involved in dealing with high-threat upset events is essential to effective recovery. Interrelated with the physiological considerations such as a racing heartbeat and sweaty palms, the same psychological considerations that pilots must contend with in flight cannot be duplicated with sufficient fidelity in the safety of today's flight simulators. In a weird twist of irony, the inherent safety of a ground-based flight simulator mutes the perception of risk and threat of consequence that pilots must be prepared for in order to safely manage the psychological effects of startle and surprise that are confronted in an actual upset event. This reality factor is something pilots must learn to face in an actual aircraft in flight. It's not safe to practice upset recoveries in airliners or transport category aircraft, business jets, or even normal category piston airplanes. The aerodynamic and structural limitations of such aircraft provide an insufficient margin of safety for pilots to learn the application of the full spectrum of ICAO-specified skills and techniques necessary to recover from airplane upsets. Instead, robust upset training aircraft capable of maneuvering safely through the full range of attitudes and flight conditions which could be encountered in airplane upsets must be used. The effective use of an all-attitude, all-envelope capable aircraft to provide upset prevention and recovery training is not itself without some challenges and risks. First, the training provided must be focused on the recovery considerations of the operational transport aircraft or airliner, not the airplane being used for training. Secondly, the techniques used must apply to the aerodynamic and structural considerations of that transport airplane. In other words, the skills taught must be transferable to the larger transport airplane in order to be useful. Airline accidents have occurred in the past due to the misapplication of pilot techniques used for maneuvering a fighter aircraft to control an airliner, which has much more limited structural margins and maneuvering capability. Regardless of the training airplane or simulator training platform used, the most important element is an instructor educated in how to correctly teach the important lessons of upset prevention and recovery training. In the end, these training changes are not as new as one might imagine. In fact, they represent a return to the past. There was a time when all pilots, both civil and military, mastered the control of their airplanes in 3 dimensions through proficiency in aerobatic maneuvering. Although on-aircraft upset prevention and recovery training differs significantly from classic aerobatic training, it still provides pilots with the complementary knowledge and manual handling skills needed to help reduce the #1 cause of fatalities in aviation, loss of control in flight. Aircraft still operate in all 3 dimensions, and comprehensive upset training delivered by a qualified instructor in actual flight will help pilots to prevent and recover from a much broader array of threats that they and their passengers may face in flight. On the behalf of Skies Magazine and Aviation Performance Solutions, or APS, this has been Randall Brooks, and I want to thank you for listening to this video recreation of the article published in Skies Magazine, upset recovery in the real world. Thank you.